doing, I just want to touch a few more, to deal with a few more legislation very, very quickly. Then we can move on to the other legislation. The first one I want to deal with is interpretation, definition of native. Something the Court of Appeals and the Federal Court find very difficult to accept is that when they hear cases from Sabah and involving native titles, they find it very difficult to accept that a person with the name of a pure Chinese name without any Christian name can be a native. And sometimes I think they want to do judgments they have actually made on the basis that they cannot believe that somebody with a pure Chinese name can be a native. But in Sabah, it is actually possible. If you come from the Pinapang district, I've been told that virtually all the so-called Kadazans in Pinapang area, they have a lot of intermarriage and they're all of mixed blood, and somewhere along the line there's some non-native blood. So there's this big issue as to whether a person is a native or not a native. Why is this important? Because only when you're a native, then you can own and deal with native titles. Native titles, as we know earlier, include field registers. So we have a legislation called the Interpretation Definition of Native Ordnance, and that's actually in your list of legislation you must know. It's a very short legislation, just a few pages, but it's something you need to know. And under this legislation, it is actually possible for someone like me, for instance, with Chinese name of Qin Su Yin, if I can claim to have native antecedents, to actually apply to the native court to hold an inquiry to determine whether or not I'm a native. And if they agree and they accept my explanation I'm a native, they will issue me a certificate, what they call the Sijil Anak Negeri. Sijil Anak Negeri, which you probably heard many times, to actually certify that I'm a native. And with that Sijil Anak Negeri, which for all purposes is actually a court order issued by the native court to declare or identify me as a native. And with that, I should be able to own native titles, I should be able to inherit native titles. The very big problem here for Kadazans is because many years ago, many of our Kadazan folk were actually working in Brunei, because Brunei was where you can get jobs, and they were working for the oil industry. And when Malaysia was formed, they remained in Brunei, and eventually they became Brunei nationals. So they were pure Kadazan family, both husband and wife are Kadazans, and they have children, and they have actually Kadazan children. The parents were originally born in Sabah, and the parents actually have properties in Sabah held under native title. But when the parents passed away in Brunei, their children, who are for all intents and purposes natives, because both parents are Kadazans, for instance, cannot inherit their parents' Sabah properties. Why? Because they are not considered natives. If you look at Article, I think 161A, capital A, of the Federal Constitution, it says that for you to be a native, you must be a citizen. So these people who are Brunei nationals are not citizens of Malaysia, so they cannot qualify to be natives, and hence they cannot inherit the native titles of their parents. So even if they go to the native court and get a Sijil Anak Negeri, the question asked is whether the native court can still declare them or identify them as a native if they are not citizens of Malaysia, which is required under Article 161 of the Federal Constitution. Coming back to the interpretation definition of native ordnance, at one time there was rampant abuse. You can actually go to a district native court and pay some bribes. At one time, I think this is way back in the 80s, the going rate was 3,000 ringgit, and you can purchase a Sijil Anak Negeri certificate. And then with that, you can buy native titles. So there was rampant abuse. People from neighboring states who don't even know if there's any difference between Kadazan and Dusun have actually Sijil Anak Negeri certificates which declare them as of Kadazan stock, and therefore own vast quantities of native titles. There was rampant abuse, and the federal government knew about this. So sometime in 1983 or 1984, the then Chief Minister of Sabah, now called Tan Sri Dato' Hari Saleh, is issued an administrative order to stop all native courts from issuing any more Sijil Anak Negeri certificates. There was a moratorium on the issuance of any further Sijil Anak Negeri certificates from 1983, I believe. His intention was very noble. It was actually to prevent abuse. But in so doing, it prevented genuine cases, genuine native cases from being properly certified. And this moratorium has existed since 1983. So in a sense, native rights, which is protected under the federal constitution, may have been prejudiced because of their inability to actually own native titles because of this moratorium. But the moratorium, I felt, was necessary because working as a conveyancing lawyer, there were many cases where it was very clear to me the person sitting in front of me was clearly not a native, had no connection sometimes even with Sabah, but still because they had this Sijil Anak Negeri certificate, they could actually purchase vast quantities of native titles. And purely through cash, they are Chinamen, they walk into the native court, deposit a certain amount of money, and they walk out of the native court a native. Something is wrong with that. So I felt the moratorium was necessary, but following the moratorium, there should be a tightening up of the procedure for the declaration of people as natives, but that didn't happen, so that's a separate story. So that's the interpretation, definition of native ordinance. So I've dealt with another legislation on your list. I will now come to another legislation on your list, which is called the Land Subsidiary Title Enactment. The Land Subsidiary Title Enactment is very important because it deals with what you probably heard as strata titles. As I said earlier at the commencement of my lecture, it is called strata title in all other jurisdictions, but in Sabah, it is called a subsidiary title. And I will explain why. And I will also explain why subsidiary title is a very appropriate name for this kind of titles. When I first started practice in 1983, there were virtually, I think, only 2 or 3 apartment blocks in the whole of KK. And the total number of units in all these apartment blocks in KK, way back in the early 80s, maybe was not more than 100 units. Now in KK, the total number of apartment units in year 2020 runs to literally hundreds of thousands. Okay. The reason for this is because land cost has gone up, construction cost has gone up, so the cost of purchasing a dwelling house has increased exponentially, becomes super expensive. So the only way to actually reduce cost is to increase the density of residential units for every square foot of land. And the only way to do this is to build upwards. So when you build upwards, you're building apartments. So way back in the 80s, it's something like maybe under 1% of Malaysians live in apartments or condominium. Now, in 2020, I think the last statistics that were produced is in excess of 30%. Over 30% of Malaysians actually stay in high-rise buildings, rumah bangsa or apartments or condo, whatever you call it, or even upper floors of shop houses. So suddenly, subsidiary titles become very important in our day-to-day lives. Okay? And I suspect some of you who are listening to this lecture are actually staying in apartments or condominium. Okay? But what is actually a subsidiary title? So, in the next 10 minutes, I will try to identify certain key phrases. And if you remember these key phrases, you will be able to understand and be able sufficient for you to advise clients on the issue of subsidiary titles. Okay? And I recall that I think at least one or two questions on this area. So basically, when you stay in a high-rise building, a high-rise building normally has facilities such as lift, there may be a swimming pool, there's a common water tank right on the roof, there's a common car park, there's a security guard, there's a guardhouse which controls people entering the house. Maybe there's also a security guard at the lift lobby, there are lifts, there's common staircase, there's a fire extinguishing system. So there are a lot of common properties, common facilities in a high-rise building. So the key important thing to remember and the fundamental principle in staying in a high-rise building is you have actually shared facilities. And because you have shared facilities, you have actually got shared responsibilities. The next 20 minutes of my lecture, everything I say can actually be justified on this key concept of high-rise living. Common facilities, and therefore there's common responsibilities. Okay? So I'm going to go through certain key phrases now, which if you remember or memorize or understand what they mean, is sufficient for you to be enough to bluff to your clients, to advise to your clients. Let's assume there's a Let's assume there's a high-rise building built on this piece of land. I hope you can see it. It's a high-rise. Let's keep things simple. Let's say it's an apartment block. Let's say there's a unit on top here which is a penthouse, block P. Okay? And let's say down on the ground floor there's a very small unit. Let's call this a studio, Lot S. Lot S probably has about 1,000 square feet. The penthouse, let's say, is 3,000 square feet. Okay? So, let's say Jeremy owns this unit, owned by Jeremy. And this unit is owned by Ain. Okay? So we have a high-rise building. Of course, a high-rise building, as I mentioned earlier, we've got common car parks here. There's a guardhouse here with a boom gate. There's maybe water tanks on top here. There's also common staircase. There's probably lifts. There's a swimming pool here. Okay, common facilities. Okay? So the first phrase I want you to remember is the word common property. All these properties which is shared in common with all the owners using this place is called common property. It's common property. Okay, all these common things shared, the swimming pool, the car park, even the lighting for the common areas, the water tank on top, the staircase, the lifts, the fire extinguishing system is shared by everyone, and all this we call the common property. what you have, what you are actually staying in this case, Jeremy's penthouse, that little box we call a parcel. Parcel. The word parcel is very important. In English, parcel means a box. A box shape. It can be rectangular in shape or completely even, but basically a box. The fundamental principle under the Land Subsidy Title Enactment, which is applicable, the same concept applies in Singapore as well in West Asia, as well as in New Zealand or Australia, is that if you ask the question, where is the parcel and what is the common property? Okay? What's the definition of parcel? The definition of parcel is anything which is not common property. What's the definition of common property? Common property is any part of the project which is not the parcel. So it's very clear. If this is common property, then this has to be parcel. If this parcel, it cannot be common property. Jeremy owns the penthouse. He owns the parcel to the penthouse. He's the king in this penthouse. But the moment he steps outside to the corridor, he steps into the common property. The reason for understanding this distinction is very, very important, because then it helps you identify whose responsibility it is if there's a problem, if there's a water leakage, if there's a damage, or if there's a breach of some bylaws. Okay? So first one, common property. Second one, parcel. Those are the phrases you have to know. So, because of shared facilities and shared responsibility, the common facilities have to be maintained. You have to pay the security guard. You've got to pay for the water to water the plants on the ground floor. You've also got to pay the electricity for the lighting. If there's a car park, there's lights. In the common property, you've got to pay for all this. Where's this money going to come from? So, the Land Subsidy Title Enactment provides a system for the imposition of the collection of a management fund. There's a system for the collection of management fund embodied in the Land Subsidy Title Enactment. Okay? So there's a system for the imposition of this fund, so that you have to collect money from Jeremy or from Ein, so that this money goes to a collective fund. And this fund is used to pay the salary, pay the water electricity, pay the lift maintenance, pay the water for the watering the landscape, pay for the maintenance of the swimming pool and all that. But then we have a problem. How much should I pay? A unit's 1,000 square feet. How much should Jeremy pay? His unit's 3,000 square feet. Okay? So the Land Subsidy Title comes up with a system to apportion that cost by prescribing to each owner what is called share units. The share units are actually mentioned in your subsidy title, in the subsidy title. So, part of the process of developing this whole project, the surveyor and the land, the property manager will look at this one and they will do a rough division. Let's assume they divide the whole project to, let's say, 1,000 share units for everyone. And they will prescribe maybe the penthouse will get probably 10 share units, and then the studio apartment will probably get 3 share units. Okay? Why? Because they say, well, it's a very small unit, and then probably only 1 or 2 persons can stay there. So the usage of the people in the studio apartment of the common property is much lower compared to the people, penthouse maybe 10 or more people may be staying, so the usage of the common property is higher. How they calculate it is an imperfect science. Sometimes they follow mere area, sometimes they follow potential number of people who can stay with them. It can be any system they use. So it's divided, and let's say in our building, the total share unit for the whole building is 1,000. And then they will prescribe penthouse will have 10 out of 1,000, and then the studio apartment will 3 out of 1,000. So coming back to our management fund, how much you have to pay and how much you pay, it depends on your share units. So if the property manager works out with a budget to maintain this building per month, comes up to, let's say, 10,000 ringgit. 10,000 ringgit to pay the salaries of the guards and cleaners and everything, whatever, 10,000 a month. So how much Jeremy has to pay or I has to pay depends on your share units. So if it's 10,000, based on your share unit, Jeremy would have to pay 10 out of 1,000 times the 10,000 ringgit. And then I would pay 3 out of 1,000 times 10,000, and that would be her share. For instance, there's a quick rent to be paid. How much should the quick rent be paid? It should be paid based on your share units. So immediately now you will see the share units is a system for determining your quantum of your responsibility, of your financial responsibility to contribute to the management fund. You can see everything I do is related to this principal concept. Okay? So this is an equitable system of determining how cost is to be shared for the maintenance of the common facilities. But share units has a special purpose, has a second purpose, which you must know. So share units have three purposes. Okay? First, it is to determine the share of your financial responsibility for the maintenance of the common property of the building. That's number one. Number two, when I say somebody going to manage this building, who's these people? Who's these people going to be managed? It's actually a council appointed from the management corporation. This is another term you must know. The management corporation. You always hear the word management corporation. Who's the management corporation? If we talk about company law, you form a syndicate perhaps with 100 shareholders. These 100 shareholders, you call them the shareholders. In a project of this nature, with let's say 100 units, the 100 owners is called the management corporation. They collectively own the common property. They collectively own the common property. So the management corporation owns the common property because it's all shared facilities, and therefore they have a shared responsibility to pay. But you cannot have 100 people making decisions. So every year, under the land subsidy title amendment, they're supposed, or within 18 months, not more than 18 months, they must call for annual general meeting. The management corporation calls for an annual general meeting, and then annual general meeting, the council is elected. Whether it's 3 persons, 5 persons, or 7 persons. You will elect the council. This is all in the land subsidy title amendment. And then the council works like the board of directors of the city and to actually run the management corporation, to actually, its primary function is to manage and maintain the common facilities in the project. Okay? So, share units, you now see, have two purposes. Firstly, to determine your share of responsibility. Second, it determines your voting rights in the annual general meeting. So in the annual general meeting, Jeremy will have 10 voting rights, I will only have 3 voting rights. Okay? So the share units determines your voting rights in the AGM. The third and final purpose of share units is, let's say this whole building one day burned down. It's not worth rebuilding it. So all the corporation got together, they hold an EGM, and they say, rather than rebuild it, let's sell the whole land. And then they sell the land, let's say for 20 million ringgit. And how you divide this 20 million? Again, this 20 million is divided based on your share units. Okay? So the final purpose of a share unit is to determine your equity in the land. Okay? Equity in the land. Equity in the main title. When subsidiary titles are issued, the main title of the land is always there. The subsidiary titles are issued subsidiary to the main title. That is why it's called subsidiary title. Whatever terms and conditions is the main title, let's say it's got only 70 years left. Because your subsidiary title is subsidiary to your main title, it means your subsidiary title is also got 70 years left. If the main title says that the annual rent is 5,000 a year, so because your titles are subsidiary to the main title, the collective owners have to pay the 5,000 annual rent per annum, because these titles are subsidiary to the main title. That's why it's called subsidiary title. Okay? So now we have common property, we've got parcel, we've got the management fund, we've got share units, we've got a council voted under the MC. The next one is, because we all stay here, you cannot go and ask the whole kampong who stay in, come down from Ranau, from Ranau to come and swim in the pool. Okay, so you must actually control. You also must control people from using the staircase as a storeroom. So all buildings there have a system of bylaws. Actually, system of bylaws, and it's the responsibility of the management corporation of the council to enforce the bylaws so that there's harmony. Like you cannot sing karaoke very loud till midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning or things like that. You cannot keep dogs in the apartments. All the bylaws in the schedule to the land subsidy title amendment, there's a sample of all these bylaws. You can take a look at it and see what it means. So in essence, if you just remember these 7 key terms, it is sufficient for you to understand the whole concept of subsidy title. And all these relate back to this main concept of subsidy title living, of shared facilities, and therefore you have shared responsibilities. One just final item I want to tell you is that this item of management fund, if you do not have money, if the management corporation doesn't have money, the common facilities cannot be maintained, the building will become in a very, very bad condition, and your investment, you stay in a penthouse and suddenly the leaves don't work, the penthouse is useless. Okay, another 2-3 minutes. Okay, so it is important for you to be able, for the management corporation to be able to enforce. Under this management fund, the management corporation, if you utang, you don't pay your contribution, it is possible for the council to register a charge unilaterally on your subsidy title, so that you are forced to pay.